Hey guys, Veebat here with another V-Plays, and we are flying in the A6M3 Experimental. This isn't your normal Zero, this is going to be a premium version, but the only major change is that I get two 30s instead of two 20mm cannons. I know it sounds like it's really great, but you'll see during the game it's a lot harder to get those to hit than it is 20s, so the consistency is a little bit off, but it feels really powerful when you watch it make contact, so it adds a little bit of flair to the aircraft. It makes it a little bit more fun to fly. But this still is going to be a good example of a turn and burn fighter, because after the P-51D videos, people asked, it would be a good contrast if you did a turn and burn video. To be honest, I'm not a big fan of turn and burn fighters. It's mostly because of the altitude bracket. I don't like the idea that could be a bomber that's wreaking havoc on the battlefield, or even a heavy, and I've got no way to counter that aircraft because I just can't get up there. But for what they are and what they're capable of doing, they're very strong. And it's the difference of, like, an altitude fighter, I feel, is kind of like a Swiss Army knife, or even a multi-roll, but this airframe, your turn and burns, are more like a scalpel. They have a very specific purpose. Usually I like to keep this aircraft at about half of its altitude before it hits max optimal, so at around 1,300 feet for a 2,600 foot ceiling, or not ceiling, but max optimal. That gives me room to turn up, because there's going to be targets above you, and even here we're getting outside of our comfortable altitude envelope, and you'll see that we're kind of bleeding a lot of speed up here. We do have 6 seconds of boost, so that allows us to be able to sustain a little bit and helps us do some of the kick turns I like to do, but we want to try and find and isolate targets, and I'm constantly looking at the minimap. I have it set up so we're max zoom so I can identify which way these arrows are pointed, and I'm constantly hitting that alt key to try and determine, okay, which direction are they facing and which target should I be going after. This brings me to another point. Much like the altitude fighters, the first thing we should be going after is like aircraft. So if we see another turn aircraft, like a turn and burn like ourselves, that should be our first priority, because if we don't catch it by surprise, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Once I take out that airframe, what's the next on my list of priorities? Well, an altitude fighter would be the next, or any other fighter. So a mid-altitude and then a high-altitude fighter. And we're pretty much going by turn capability, because that's where our strength is. So we want to triage our targets based on max turn times. So low altitude fighter, mid altitude fighter, high altitude fighter, and then multi-roll, as you see me coming up against this F4F. Next would be a heavy fighter, and then the last thing I'd honestly want to go after would actually be a ground attacker. Not just because I know I can outturn it, but because the tail gunners are really going to wreck this airframe. You'll note that even for a tier 5, 176 hit point pool, 176. There's nothing there, and our resistance to fire in a Japanese fighter is very low. We only have a 30 for resistance to fire. I'm not sure if that maxes out at 100 or not, but I know compared to other airframes that's really low. I think the Mustang's in the 60s. We'll take a look at it towards the end of this video, but yeah, it's just not great. So we need to make sure that we're paying attention to who's coming towards us, which is why I'm kind of target switching. I was kind of going after that multi-roll, then I saw this boomerang, and I'm switching targets. If I see an aircraft that looks like it might be vectored on me, I immediately turn my nose towards the aircraft. Not to necessarily engage it in head-to-head combat, but if I'm heading towards the aircraft and then I kind of make a rolling maneuver, like a barrel roll, it's going to be hard for them to get their guns on me. We'll pass each other, and I know I can win to get on their tail in most instances. So that's why we want to make sure we're controlling those engagements. Identify where the enemy is and get on them. Staying at an airfield is going to be your best bet. First target you want to go for, if you're going to choose zones, airfield is going to be perfect for us, because it's going to have a lot of light fighters for us to shoot down so we can flip the zone. Garrison would be the next best bet. And then for offensive zones, we can help out with a command center, because a command center has light fighters as the air defense aircraft. But if it's a military facility, it has heavies, and if it's a mining plant, There's no aircraft. So what are we going to do? We're going to shoot ground targets? It's not worth our time. Because the only thing we could possibly do is counter a ground attacker, but I already said that's like the last thing we want to do, especially since their tail gunner can get on us. We do see Super Papa's here. He's actually a pretty good player, and he's in a specialized XP-55, so we want to make sure that we isolate and destroy, because that aircraft can be very dangerous to us. But again, we took out the fighter. Now we're going after the multi-role because that's what's available. We have another multi-role, another F4F, and this one is controlled by the other player. And you can see here how inaccurate the 30s can be at range. They need to be much closer. The 20s have a little bit more consistency in these instances. So it's different, not necessarily better, that I have running this premium aircraft. But I know a lot of people swear by this platform, especially for getting Guardian medals. So somebody called me out for there's a possibility I only show you guys my good battles, and I only show you battles that I might have played during non-peak hours. This is non-peak hours. I got out of work early today, so I just wanted to disclose that. And you know, as for showing you not only the best battles, yeah, this was a perfect battle to show you because it actually had an airfield in the middle. But the battle before this, it didn't go so hot because I actually forgot how to fly a turn and burn, go figure, and I immediately went towards a military facility and then climbed up to 5,000 feet. So it would have been a really good example of what not to do, but this battle lasted a lot longer and is a good example of what to do. Now, is controlling and maintaining an airfield that big of an advantage? Most of the time, I'm going to say no. Like if I'm in an altitude fighter, I'm in a multi-role, I've got better things I can be doing. I can be helping to defend and take offensive objectives. Those are going to be more valuable. But airfields still have a place and are still important because an airfield gives your teammates a respawn point, and it also reduces the respawn time. So think about this. Let's say I have bot bombers I'm working with. Those bot bombers are going in and attacking one of these garrisons, or even ground attackers. And every time they go in there, maybe they're getting killed by the enemy. But my guys are coming back quicker, they're respawning from a central location, so they're able to get to that target that much faster, so the enemy has to deal with this continuous wave of enemies coming in, and if all things are equal, bot v bot, eventually we'll capture that site because we have the advantage of less time to get to the target, and we're also coming back that much faster. So there is something to be said for it, and it can be a big force multiplier. There's our Guardian badge. Usually you'll get that in a turn fighter as well, because typically you're over an airfield, the enemy's going to keep going towards it, especially a central location, and you can continuously get back capture points like we're doing here. Now, you don't have to just stay at the airfield. There are maps where the airfields aren't in the central location like this, they're on the periphery. But let's say there was a military facility in the middle of the map. That doesn't mean your turn and burn fighter can't work there. Turn and burn fighter can eventually make their way towards the middle, and now they can operate as a defensive aircraft to take out any of those multi-role aircraft that might be coming in trying to flip the zone, and they can keep it protected. So this becomes a bit of a point defense in those instances, and it's good for that. It's good for an area denial, so anything at this altitude is going to run into some serious problems with this airframe, except for maybe a ground attacker. You can engage ground attackers. I advise avoiding it. It's not my primary, but if you are forced in that situation, you can still win those engagements, especially if you're fighting any of the Russian IL series, tier 8 and below. The tail gunners are oriented in an upward direction, so you can come in from the side or underneath to minimize the time that they can fire on you, but be aware that German ground attackers are going to have the ability to fire in a much wider arc up and down and are a lot faster and more maneuverable. So if there's a player controlling it, they may turn guns on you, and their tail gunners can definitely devastate your platforms. So if you do have to go after those, usually it's good to go in pairs. That way you're not the one taking most of the damage, because if you die in the zone, you're not helping anyone. Anyways, let's get to the end game results and talk about this aircraft and setup a little bit more. Alright, so this was a premium aircraft, so we got a lot more credits than usual, and we got some tokens, which is cool, but we're really not here to talk about endgame results, right? We're here to talk about tactics and how to kind of fly a turn fighter. So uh, you you can rack up some serious kills here when you're flying this aircraft, but again, like I said, the priorities were going after low altitude fighters, and then altitude fighters that drop down into your bracket, and then multi-rolls, which you're going to see quite often, and you'll easily be able to outturn. Although they can run away from you, so don't chase them too much, they will get away. Heavies are an option as well if they drop down, and they're going to be a dangerous threat, so if you can get a brushing pass with your guns, at the very least, they'll know that you're paying attention. And then ground attackers would be your last resort. I try to avoid going after ground attackers because they have so much tail fire, or should I say, tail gunner damage coming from those airframes, and with how thin skinned turn fighters are, they just don't have the longevity to be able to sit inside of that arc of fire and really be able to survive. So you very much have to pay attention to the arc of fire. If it's going to be anything from the Russian line, the IL series, anything prior to the IL-40 are all going to be an upward firing arc. So if you come up from underneath the aircraft or come in from the side and then go underneath the airframe, you're actually going to have much less of a chance of those guns getting on you. But if you're going up against the German ground attackers, their arc of fire is very wide on the tail gunners starting at the 265. So be very careful of that, especially since the Zeros in particular have a very high chance of fire because their resistance to fire is only 30. And if you haven't paid attention to these numbers before, let me show you a comparison. The B-32, yeah, we'll disable the filter. The B-32 actually has 96 resistance to fire, and the I-211 has 45. So this is just different classes of airframe, right? So, but the light fighters typically are much more susceptible to fire. And let's look at the American Tier 7 fighter. And you'll see that the P-51 is actually 60 resistance to fire. And that's just by nature of the types of airframes and what you get as some of the weaknesses in order to gain other strengths. So when we look at that Zero airframe at Tier 5 Premium Japanese, there we go. Very susceptible to fire, very low hit points. So you have to constantly keep your head on a swivel. You got to know what's going on, pay attention to the mini-map, see where aircraft are vectored, and make sure that if anybody's coming towards you, you're constantly switching targets, because every time you're locked onto an aircraft, you're at your most vulnerable. Somebody's going to get in behind you. So just keep turning, find another target. If it looks like there's an arrow pointed at you, turn. Even if they're might be at a different altitude block, turn anyways until you can verify that they're at a different altitude block. Because if you are wrong and they're at your altitude block, they're going to crush you. So just be wary. Altitude fighters and heavies, you got to keep your head up looking for those targets, because like we did in the P-51, you come down and you do a boom and zoom run on one of these guys, I'm already susceptible to fire. My P-51, if I were flying that against one of these Zeros, I can totally win that by lighting them on fire and essentially crippling their airframe, because then what they're going to have to do is use their firefighter skill if they're smart enough to put it on, or their fire extinguisher. But if you're using firefighter, you actually got to roll the aircraft and you kind of got to straighten out, and in doing so, you've now lost your advantage whatever turn fight you are in. We do have quite a bit of modules on here to enhance turn capability, but I'd make the argument that you could easily put on here a operated engine. I don't necessarily think that the boost injection system is worthwhile on this. Losing what's already a low boost time of 6 seconds is probably not advantageous to that much of an extent, but operated engine will allow you to be able to maintain speed in a turn fight. Zeros tend not to suffer too much here, but Spitfires do benefit from having an operated engine just to be able to maintain the speed in the turn, but you know, your mileage may vary. That just works for me. And then, of course, with lightweight wing frame, it's usually a solid go-to on almost any platform, especially if you're going for a balanced build. But right now, we're looking at a 7.8 second turn time, and I'm not even specialized. So very strong platform for turn capability. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.
till it's over.